How AI is Enhancing API Documentation by Chris Hood, CMO, PolyAPI, May 2nd, 2025. API documentation has long been the foundation of software development, integration, and collaboration. Yet for all its importance, traditional documentation practices often lag behind the speed and complexity of modern software development. Teams deploy faster, build microservices rapidly, and integrate with dozens of third-party platforms. But the documentation often comes later, incomplete, or not at all. This is where artificial intelligence is beginning to reshape the landscape. By automating and enhancing how documentation is captured, structured, and surfaced, AI is helping developers move faster, avoid mistakes, and retain institutional knowledge in ways that static docs never could. Rather than replacing developers or writers, AI is a force multiplier, automating the rote work and surfacing the most relevant information in context. Let's explore how AI is changing API documentation and how platforms like PolyAPI are helping teams turn API sprawl into structured, reliable, and accessible information. The challenges of traditional API documentation. Before diving into AI, it's important to understand why documentation has been a pain point for so long. In many teams, API documentation is a manual task. Developers often write it after coding is complete or skip it altogether. Even when tools like OpenAPI or Swagger are used, the documentation may lack meaningful descriptions or fail to stay in sync with live deployments. Some common challenges include documentation is written once but never updated, missing or inconsistent descriptions of endpoints, parameters, or responses, APIs without any documentation at all, lack of visibility into internal functions or events, difficulty navigating and searching large API catalogs. The number of interfaces skyrockets as teams adopt microservices, serverless functions, and real-time event-driven architectures. Without a scalable system, teams lose track of what they've built and how it's supposed to work. AI introduces new methods to address these problems automatically and in real time. What AI brings to API documentation. AI enhances documentation in three key ways. Automatic capture of behavior. Instead of relying on developers to describe every endpoint, AI can observe how APIs behave. For example, it can monitor requests through tools like Postman or Record Live API traffic to understand usage patterns. Smart generation of descriptions and schemas. Using machine learning models trained on large sets of public and private APIs, AI can generate function summaries, parameter descriptions, and schema definitions. It can fill in missing documentation based on naming conventions, behavior, and common patterns. Context-aware delivery. AI enables dynamic, searchable documentation to be delivered directly to developers' tools, such as IDEs. Rather than reading docs in a separate browser tab, developers can search for and use APIs within their code environment, complete with type safety and auto-suggestions. These enhancements make documentation more accurate, complete, and accessible. How PolyAPI uses AI to enhance documentation. PolyAPI is a platform built around the idea that documentation, integration, and development should all happen together. Rather than treat documentation as a separate phase, PolyAPI captures and generates documentation as part of the development and deployment process. Here's how it works in practice. 1. Capture API behavior from Postman. When a team is working in Postman or making live API calls without existing documentation, PolyAPI can observe those requests and generate structured documentation based on the payloads, endpoints, and parameters in use. This allows developers to document APIs without writing anything manually. The documentation reflects actual usage, which makes it more reliable and useful. 2. Ingest and enhance. OpenAPI specifications. If you already use OpenAPI or Swagger files, PolyAPI can ingest them and fill in any missing pieces. Many teams stop at generating the skeleton, but Poly enhances the spec with descriptions, schemas, and connections to actual function implementations or event handlers. This improves the readability and usability of your docs, especially for external consumers or partner teams. 3. Catalog new microservices automatically. As your teams deploy new services, PolyAPI detects them at runtime. It catalogs functions, events, and microservices and generates metadata, typed schemas, and links to the source code. All of this is available for indexing, search, and code generation. You no longer need to maintain a central wiki or worry about tracking what each team is building. PolyAPI builds and updates the catalog automatically. 4. Pre-trained API knowledge for faster starts. PolyAPI comes pre-trained on approximately 1,000 commonly used API functions. This allows developers to start building immediately using familiar patterns and examples. If your internal function resembles a popular public API, PolyAPI can suggest structure, naming, and schema templates. This speeds up onboarding, reduces documentation errors, and allows developers to work faster from day one. Documentation. Inside the IDE, one of the most practical ways PolyAPI improves developer workflows is by bringing everything directly into the IDE. As developers write code, they can discover APIs, functions, and events available in their environment, view typed definitions and usage patterns, generate example code based on their stack, TypeScript, Python, Java, Net, search by keyword, context, or schema copy function calls that include correct payloads and authentication references. Because the SDKs are generated automatically with proper type safety, developers get immediate feedback if they use the wrong parameters or forget the required fields. This reduces errors and removes the need to switch browser tabs or reference outdated documentation. Retaining institutional knowledge. One of the most valuable outcomes of AI-generated documentation is knowledge retention. Developers come and go in fast-moving teams, services change, and naming conventions evolve. New team members struggle to understand what has been built without up-to-date documentation, and legacy services become harder to maintain. PolyAPI captures and maintains this information automatically. Each API, function, or event includes structured documentation. The documentation is tied to source code and schema definitions. A full history of activity supports compliance and troubleshooting. Search and discovery are consistent across all services. This keeps institutional knowledge intact and accessible even as teams scale or reorganize. The next phase of documentation. As APIs continue to evolve, the need for consistent, accurate, and accessible documentation will only grow. AI is here to support developers by doing the repetitive, time-consuming, and often neglected parts. PolyAPI combines intelligent automation with developer-centric design. It supports every stage of the API lifecycle, from discovery and design to deployment and documentation. The result is a platform that helps developers move faster, reduce errors, and retain control of their growing service ecosystems. If your documentation still relies on manual updates and scattered wikis, now is a good time to rethink the role AI can play. Explore how PolyAPI helps teams retain knowledge, reduce support needs, and integrate services faster.